Okay, today we're going to take a deep look at two poems within this collection, Best New Poets 2019, which is, by the way, our last and final lecture together. So you made it through to the end. Great job, everyone. Then I'm going to offer two poems that simply aren't working within the collection due to a very specific reason. So let's go ahead and take a look at the first poem that is working. Okay, the first poem we're going to look at is nearly, if not entirely, a persona poem. As we get the pronouns I, our, we, point of view of the speaker. With regard to background information, I think it's important to understand who the Dionne quintuplets were. They were the first quintuplets known to have survived their infancy. The identical girls were born just outside Callander, Ontario, near the village of Carbell. All five survived to adulthood. The Dionne girls were born 2 months premature. After 4 months with their family, custody was signed over to the Red Cross, who paid for the care and oversaw the building of a hospital for these sisters. Less than a year after this agreement was signed, the Ontario government stepped in and passed the Dionne Quintuplets Guardianship Act in 1935, which made them wards of the Crown until the age of 18. The Ontario provincial government and those around them began to profit by making them a significant tourist attraction. So something that was sort of kind of a deplorable act. Let's go ahead and read Quintland, as it's called, aloud. And there's an epigraph with it. So I'll go ahead and read it. Yvonne, Annette, Cecile, Emilia, and Marie Dion, the first quintuplets known to survive infancy, lived in Quintland, a Canadian tourist attraction from 1934 to 1943. And it's interesting, it's split up into 6 sections, it looks like, 6 stanzas and sections that she bifurcates and fragments with Roman numerals. So section 1, women in matching dresses zip us into matching dresses. They weave ribbon through our whirled locks when we make a brush them into 5 crooked streams before bed. We roll on the ground just to knock the bobby pins out of place, just to feel their hands again in our hair. Yellow tape cinches our skin. They speak to each other in our numbers. The nursery's filled with colors, but we can only touch our own. If we cry or shout, pens move quickly behind their clipboards, ink to paper like teeth against teeth. The man in white puts metal to our hearts. His small light floods our ears and eyes. He strikes both knees with a rubber triangle, smiling each time we kick. Through whispers, we pump our legs across the lawn, singing. All we can see is the screen around us, not the people gathered behind. Never their faces, just shadows, growing long. They say my fingers bathed us in olive oil when we were born. An open stove lit the embers of our limbs. Each time our lungs barked like stray dogs for scraps. An eyedropper fed us cow's milk, boiled water, syrup, rum. When we dance around our bedroom, sisters circling sisters, I see myself repeating in an angled mirror, the kind I imagine a mother keeps on her vanity, that she'd look into as she wiped the red from her smile, spotting me alone at the door. Okay. The first thing I noticed in this poem was the use of I, we, our pronouns, allowing this poem to fall into the persona poetry category as we mentioned above. I thought that by entering these very close pronouns and ultimately these remarkable individuals from history, Claren, the poet, is permitting a certain intimacy whereby we can hear these infants/toddlers' voices spread across the page and even time. Lines especially indicative of that are, quote, the man white puts metal to our hearts, unquote, and, quote, he strikes both knees with a rubber triangle, unquote. The language built within these lines are in keeping with the language of a child's interpretation of the outside world. Instead of stethoscope, here she uses metal. Instead of what's called a reflex hammer, she uses rubber triangle, all incorporated as a function of attempting to enter the point of view of a child. Interestingly, too, is how the metal of our hearts is working in tandem. That is to say, the metal to our hearts is the medical instrument to measure heart rate/heartbeats, but the metal to our hearts can and is symbolizing the cold and callous treatment towards these sisters who would ultimately become institutionalized wards of the state, or in this case, province or crown. The fourth stanza is interesting too, and I'll just go ahead and reread it out loud. Through whispers we pump our legs. Through whispers we pump our legs across the lawn, singing. All we can see is the screen around us, not the people gathered behind. Never their faces to shadows growing long. So if you think about this 4 stanzas, push it if you can, and I know it should be, through Plato's allegory of the cave. How the screen of this stanza is the perception that it is of these sisters, how society synthesizes, and in this case, even fictionalizes their existence by them being deemed and even groomed as tourist attractions in their case. Finally, the last stanza offers us, quote, I see myself repeating in an angled mirror, unquote. Uh, Powerful imagery in allowing the sight of these identical quintuplets to be represented by the phenomenon known as infinite regression, meaning through symbolism can be derived from the concept of infinite regression to regress, not as binary opposition, which would be to progress, can symbolize the sisters never maintaining a normal childhood, but instead being subjected to becoming an object of obsession, a curiosity of the human limits, infinitely regressing instead of advancing in their emotions, in their psychological states, their psychosocial states, and even their lives. Okay, here's the last poem that I want us to look at today. As you can see here, it's titled The Spine of Goree Island, Contrapuntal. Okay, quick history lesson on this poem, The Spine of Goree Island, Contrapuntal. Goree Island is located near the sea from the main harbor of Dakar, Senegal, and is famous as a destination for people interested in the Atlantic slave trade, although its actual role in the history of slave trade is a subject of dispute. Before I read the poem aloud, it's important to understand its unique structure. What's known as the title denotes, is a contrapuntal poem. This type of poem has a point and a counterpoint. What contrapuntal actually translates to, counterpoint. So in this way, as you see, there are two stanzas, but this poem can actually be read three different ways. One, we can read the left stanza, which should be able to stand alone with its own readability and internal logic. Two, we can read the right stanza, which should be able to stand alone with its own readability and internal logic. And three, and finally, the stanzas can be combined to read it like you would left to right in the instance of a normal or traditional poem, all parts combining to derive meaning. I'll go ahead and read it in all three conditions. I think the only thing we need to know is the translation of Maison des Esclaves, or House of Slaves, which is a museum and memorial to the Atlantic slave trade on Goree Island. Here we go. The Spine of Goree Island, Contrapuntal. So I'll just read the left stanza, and then I'll read the right stanza, and then I'll combine all two. I made my first ragdoll at 3. It's a coming of age of sorts, where we learn to identify pain in our bodies. At the Maison des Esclaves, I am 3 again, learning and unlearning things about pain. The cell downstairs looks like the child detention center my dear friend recalls 20 years after her escape. The walls remind me of Abuela's home, and these walls, they are screaming. At the Maison des Esclaves, I am 3 again. There is pain in my small intestine, though it could have been stopped. Okay, now I'll read the right stanza. Our healer reminds us she's not eternal. Each child must tend to their body. No one ever expected this amount of pain. There are stories, my body remembers these stories, of dispossession. Those who took us, in the water, awful, there is no way out. The intimacy of this haunting reminds me of my crossing. Quiet sounds of leaving one must face. Masters lived here and there is French, Spanish, and Dutch. And here we are reminded that we just weren't people. Now I'll combine both, reading as a traditional left to right poem. I made my first ragdoll at 3. Our healer reminds us she's not eternal. It's a coming of age of sorts. Each child must tend to their body, where we learn to identify pain. No one ever expected this amount of pain. In our bodies, there are stories. As a Maison des Esclaves, my body remembers these stories. I am 3 again, learning of dispossession and unlearning things about those who took us. Pain in the water. The cell downstairs looks awful. Like the child detention center, there is no way out. My dear friend recalls the intimacy of this haunting. 20 years after her escape, reminds me of my crossing. The walls remind me of Abuela's, quiet sounds of leaving, home, and these walls one must face. They are screaming at the Maison. Masters lived here, and des Esclaves, I am 3 again. There is French, Spanish, and Dutch. There is pain in my small intestine. And here we are reminded that, though it could have been stopped, we just weren't people. Okay, as the poem offers a point and then a counterpoint should do, it resists or conflicts against each other, the left and right stanza. Then finally, it reaches some level of harmony in its holisticness. everything a counter poem is required to do. I think Lopez's poem is exemplary of that fact, working with and against himself in a sort of push-pull effect. That is to say, the left stanza gives us language that builds towards the speaker being a child, freshly imprisoned uh, in this place, this enslavement. Then we transition to the right stanza to get language that builds towards the speaker transitioning to adulthood, made available through such language as, quote, my body remembers these stories, unquote, as if they were from a distant past, and, quote, of dispossession, unquote, which is a fairly sophisticated word that's indicative of an adult speaker, as is, quote, the intimacy of this haunting, unquote, also demonstrating a sort of maturation process that takes place from the left stanza to the right stanza. Then, of course, when read as a traditional left to right poem, the speaker becomes one, but still seemingly vying for their own space on the page. Finally, even the title of the poem seems to evoke the stark ugliness of trafficking human lives through slave trade. Gory. How gory and grotesque is such a deplorable act, it seems to beg. Okay, I think this poem is working quite well with its form or structure in the contrapuntal form or structure. Some poems within this collection, however, that I think the form or structure is working against the actual content are a conversation with my therapist, a letter I want to send to my ex-boyfriend, but will keep for myself on page 92. Much like the poem above, this is for all intents and purposes a contrapuntal poem as well. That part is working quite well within the poem, but setting the poem on its side seems to be distracting away from its power as a contrapuntal poem. If you go look at the poem and read it, hopefully you have, you can see it's on its side on the actual page. There's really no reason for that. What is the effect it's attempting to imbue? I don't know. The same can be said for the poem by John Patrick McShay on page 70 and 71. It seems to follow the structure of a contrapuntal poem as well, but is distracting away from its meaning and even beauty by casting sideways on the page. Okay, questions. As always, please email me if you have any questions or concerns. Note, I'm going to go question by question on the poetry test to correct, as some of you have noted, answers you got right, but were for some reason labeled as wrong. The final essay is due Monday, June 1st by midnight. Emailed to me, please. I'll email everyone their Chickamauga essay with my comments by Sunday morning, so look out for that. Look for your grades to be posted to Blackboard by the end of the first week of June as well, so next week. It's been an absolute pleasure lecturing to you and hearing your unique voices and perspectives within each essay. If you have any questions in the future with any other classes or you need any sort of aid from me with interpretation of anything, just let me know, reach out to me, and I'll certainly help you out. Thanks a lot, guys. Talk to you later. Bye.